Have you ever considered that relief might arrive wearing the mask of danger? That the end of hardship could usher in something far more uncertain than what came before? Tonight we drift into a season rarely remembered, the weeks when winter's grip finally loosened on the American frontier, and survival became more precarious than it had ever been beneath the snow. We think of spring as awakening, as hope renewed, as the earth breathing again after months of frozen silence. But for those who lived in rough-hewn cabins along the edge of wilderness, spring arrived not as deliverance, but as disruption, a season of mud so deep it swallowed wagon wheels, of water that flowed where it shouldn't, of structures that sagged and shifted as the frozen ground beneath them turned to something like a slow, cold liquid. Before we step into this muddy passage through the early American frontier, I'd ask a small favor: tap that like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History, so these quiet journeys through forgotten corners of the past will always find you in the stillness. Leave a comment below telling me where you're listening from, what hour finds you now, whether you're wrapped in the deep quiet of night, or just beginning to stir as daylight breaks, or somewhere in that soft space between. Now, dim your lights if you can, perhaps let a gentle fan hum in the background, and settle in as we enter this unmarked season, the thaw, when the frontier became not easier to endure, but somehow more difficult, more uncertain, more quietly desperate. Imagine yourself in a place where winter was at least predictable. Cold, yes, brutally so, but knowable. You understood its rules, you prepared for its arrival with as much food and firewood as you could gather. You knew that snow would pile against your door, that your breath would frost in the air, even inside your cabin, that the world outside would become a landscape of white silence, broken only by the crack of freezing wood and the occasional howl of wind through gaps in your walls. But the thaw obeyed no such logic. It crept in slowly at first, then all at once, transforming the solid ground you'd trusted for months into something treacherous and alive. The snow you'd grown accustomed to didn't simply melt away. It collapsed, it flooded, it turned pathways into rivers and clearings into shallow lakes that never seemed to drain. What had been hard became soft, what had been predictable became chaotic, and what you thought would bring relief brought only new forms of struggle. Tonight, we walk, or perhaps wade, through those weeks together. We'll feel the cold wetness seeping through boot leather that never quite dries. We'll watch as structures built on frozen earth begin their slow surrender to gravity. We'll understand why so many who survived brutal winters wrote with greater anxiety about the spring that followed, and why the thaw tested not just physical endurance, but something deeper. The quiet faith that the worst was behind you, that holding on through winter meant you'd made it through. Let your breathing slow, let the weight of the day begin to lift. We're moving backward now into a time when the turning of seasons meant something different than it does for us. When relief and danger could wear the same face, when the earth itself became uncertain, and when those who'd learned to survive winter had to learn all over again how to survive its ending. You wake to the sound of water. Not rain, you'd recognize that, but something more persistent, more intrusive. It's the sound of snow surrendering, of ice giving way, of winter's architecture collapsing into itself. The roof above you drips in a rhythm that would be soothing if it weren't for what it means. Each drop finds a new path through the bark shingles you laid last autumn before you truly understood how a frontier cabin settles and shifts. The sound echoes in the darkness before dawn, and you know already that today will be like yesterday, and the day before, a long, damp struggle against problems that multiply faster than you can address them. You're already awake when the first grey light seeps through the gap between door and frame. That gap has widened over the past week as the cabin's corner posts have begun their slow, uneven descent into softening earth. You notice these things now with a practiced eye, the way a sailor reads the sea, not with alarm, but with constant, grinding attention. The cold is different than it was a month ago. Then it came from above and from the wind that found every crack in your walls. Now it rises from below, from the ground itself, a damp chill that settles in your bones and doesn't leave even when you're near the fire. Your feet are always cold, your socks perpetually damp despite being dried by the hearth each night. You sit up on your straw mattress, which has absorbed so much moisture from the air that it no longer crackles when you move. Instead, it compresses with a soft, defeated sound. Your blankets smell of smoke and something else, the particular scent of wool that's been damp too long, starting its slow journey toward rot. The cabin's single room is dim and close. Your breath still fogs the air, though not with the sharp clarity of deep winter. This is a wetter cold, a cold that clings. The fire from last night has died to ash, and you'll need to coax it back to life with kindling you've kept as dry as you can manage, wrapped in what remains of an old canvas tarp. Before you attend to the fire, you do what you've done every morning. For 2 weeks now, you check the walls. The logs that form your cabin structure were notched and stacked when the ground was frozen solid, each one settling on the one below with the permanence you'd hoped would last. But as the earth beneath the corner posts has softened, the entire structure has begun to shift in ways you can't quite predict. The northeastern corner, the one that bears the most weight from the roof, has sunk perhaps 3 inches into what used to be solid ground. This settling has pulled at the joints, opened gaps, let in not just air, but water. You've stuffed these gaps with moss and mud, but each day seems to reveal new openings, as if the cabin itself is slowly exhaling, coming apart in increments too small to fix, but too significant to ignore. You run your hand along the interior wall and feel the dampness there, the logs weeping with absorbed meltwater. Outside you know what waits without having to open the door. The snow that was piled waist-high against the cabin's northern wall has collapsed into itself, creating a slurry of ice and dirt and last autumn's leaves that leans against your home like something trying to push its way in. The pathway you'd packed down all winter, walking the same route between cabin and woodpile and privy until it became a shallow trench in the snow, has disappeared entirely, replaced by ankle-deep mud that tries to claim your boots with every step. You push the door open, and it drags against earth that wasn't there yesterday. The threshold has sunk, or the ground outside has risen. The effect is the same. You'll need to trim the bottom of the door again, the 3rd time since the thaw began, until there's almost nothing left to trim. The morning air hits you with its particular quality of damp cold, heavy with moisture, thick in your lungs. The sky is the color of old pewter, low and close. No sun will break through today, you can tell already. No chance for anything to properly dry. Your boots stand where you left them by the door, and you know before touching them that they're still wet inside. They've been wet for 9 days now. You've tried everything, stuffing them with heated stones wrapped in cloth, positioning them near the fire, but not so close they crack, even sleeping with them under your blankets to warm them with your own body heat. Nothing works. The leather has absorbed so much water it's beginning to soften and stretch in ways that make them fit wrong, rubbing new sores on your heels and the tops of your feet. You pull them on anyway, feeling the cold, damp leather close around your wool socks. Socks that started this morning dry, or nearly so, but won't be dry again until you peel them off tonight. The sensation makes you shudder, but you've learned not to delay. Better to get the shock of it over with and let your feet go numb than to prolong the anticipation. The mud outside is worse than yesterday. The temperature rose overnight. You could tell from inside the cabin, the way the dripping intensified, the way the air felt looser somehow. That rise of a few degrees means the ground has released more of its frozen water, and now the earth itself seems uncertain whether it's solid or liquid. Your first steps sink 4 inches deep, and the mud makes a sound as it releases your boot, a wet sucking that will become the soundtrack of your days. You've learned to walk differently now, lifting your feet high with each step, placing them carefully, never rushing. Rushing means falling, and falling means your clothes get soaked, and wet clothes in this weather might as well be a kind of slow violence against your own body. The woodpile is 20 paces from your door. It takes you 3 times as long to reach it as it did a month ago. The wood you'd stacked so carefully in autumn, bark side up to shed snow, cross-hatched for air circulation, is now partially collapsed. The lower logs have been sitting in melt for days, wicking up water like thirsty roots. When you pull a piece of firewood free, the underside is dark with moisture and feels heavy in your hands, not waterlogged yet, but heading there. You select the driest pieces you can find, knowing that in another week there may be no dry pieces left, and you'll be burning green wood that smokes more than it heats, that fills your cabin with acrid clouds, that makes your eyes water and your throat roar. You've seen this happen to neighbors, and you've helped them when you could, sharing your drier wood, because out here, refusing to help isn't really an option. You're all holding on by similarly thin threads. Back inside, you build up the fire with the careful attention of someone who knows that warmth is currency, that each flame must be coaxed and maintained, that there's no margin for waste. The wood catches slowly, reluctantly, and you blow on it gently, feeding it splinters of pine that you've kept in your driest corner, waiting for it to establish itself before adding larger pieces. While the fire builds, you turn your attention to breakfast. The barrel where you store your cornmeal is in the corner, and when you lift the lid, your heart sinks a little further. The meal is clumped, pressed into damp masses that resist your wooden spoon. Not mouldy yet, but no longer the dry, flowing grain you'd stored away. You scrape out what you need for johnny cakes, mixing it with water from the bucket by the door, water you carried yesterday from the creek, which has swollen from a quiet trickle into something loud and angry, running brown with sediment. The water in the bucket has a thin skin of ice on top despite being indoors. You break through it with your fingers, feeling the shock of cold, and dip out what you need. You don't drink this water without boiling it first, not anymore. Last week, your nearest neighbor, a man named Hodges, who lives 2 miles east, came down with flux so severe his wife had to ride for help. The doctor, when he finally arrived 6 days later, the roads being what they are, said it was likely the water, contaminated by snowmelt washing through animal waste and God knows what else. You fry your johnny cakes in the iron skillet using the last of the bacon grease you've been rationing. They cook unevenly because the fire isn't hot enough yet, and you eat them while they're still warm, standing up, looking through your single window at the grey expanse outside. The window glass, real glass, which you paid dearly for and transported carefully, is fogged with condensation. You wipe it with your sleeve and look out at your small kingdom of mud. The garden plot where you'll need to plant in another month is underwater, a shallow pond that reflects the sky. Your fence line, such as it is, has collapsed in 3 places where the posts have simply fallen over, no longer held by frozen ground. Beyond the fence you can see the dark line of trees where the forest begins. You'd cut back those trees last summer, clearing land for cultivation, and the stumps still remain, too large to pull, too difficult to burn. Now they stand in mud like broken teeth, and you wonder how you'll ever get a plow through ground this soft, how you'll know when the earth is ready to receive seed. After breakfast, if 2 johnny cakes and a cup of weak tea can be called that, you begin the day's work. Not the work you'd planned, but the work the Thaw demands. The privy needs attention first. Built over a pit dug deep when the ground was cooperative, it now tilts at an angle that will soon make it unusable. The pit itself is filling with meltwater, rising dangerously close to the seat. You'll need to dig a new one, but you can't dig in this mud. Can't make a hole that won't simply fill with water and collapse. So you do what you can, which is to shore up the existing structure with boards you can't really spare, wedging them into mud that might hold for a day or a week or not at all. You work slowly, methodically, your hands already aching with cold despite the gloves you wear, gloves that are also damp, that protect less each day. The chickens, you had 7 at winter's start, are now down to 4. 3 have died in the past 2 weeks, their feet having rotted from standing in wet straw that you couldn't keep dry no matter how often you changed it. The survivors huddle in their coop, miserable and cold, producing perhaps 1 egg between them every 2 days. You know you should slaughter them, preserve the meat while they're still worth eating, but you keep hoping they'll recover when things dry out, if things dry out. You scatter grain for them, grain that's also begun to clump with moisture. And you try not to think about how quickly your stores are diminishing, how much you've lost to spoilage and damp. The root cellar you dug last autumn, deep enough to stay cool in summer you'd thought, has betrayed you. Water has found its way in through cracks you couldn't see, couldn't have predicted. Half your potatoes have gone soft with rot, and the turnips are sprouting in the wet darkness, growing pale, useless shoots. You've salvaged what you can, but you know the math. You know how many meals stand between you and real hunger. Around mid-morning you hear something that makes you stop work and listen. It's the sound of a wagon, or what sounds like it might be a wagon, coming along the road. Though road is too generous a word for the rutted track that connects your homestead to others, you walk to the edge of your clearing and wait, curious who would attempt travel on such a day. The wagon appears slowly, drawn by 2 oxen that strain with each step, their hooves sinking deep, their breath coming hard. The driver is a man you recognize, Patterson, whose claim is 5 miles north. His wagon is loaded with lumber, and you can see immediately that he's in trouble. The wheels are sunk nearly to their axles, and the oxen are losing their purchase, sliding as much as pulling. You call out to him, offering help, and together you spend the next hour trying to free his wagon. You lay boards under the wheels, you push, you cajole the animals, and finally, the wagon lurches forward onto slightly higher ground. Patterson thanks you with exhaustion in his eyes, tells you he's trying to reach the settlement, needs to trade the lumber for cornmeal before his family runs out. He doesn't say what will happen if he doesn't make it in time. He doesn't need to. You watch him continue on, the wagon moving at a pace barely faster than walking, and you understand that he might not reach the settlement today, or tomorrow, or at all. The roads have swallowed other wagons this season. You've heard stories. You wonder if you should have offered him some of your own cornmeal, but you can't afford to, not really. You have your own people to think about, yourself, and the nephew who might arrive in the spring to help work the land if the roads allow it. The afternoon brings rain, not heavy but steady, and you retreat inside to work on the tasks that never end. Your clothes need mending, seams have split, hems have torn, everything is wearing out faster than you can repair it. You sit by the fire with needle and thread, squinting in the dim light, making stitches that are functional if not beautiful. Outside, the rain turns the mud even wetter, makes the sound of dripping more insistent. You look up at the ceiling periodically, watching for new leaks, and you find one. A dark spot spreading slowly near the center of the room. You place a wooden bowl beneath it, hearing the irregular plink of water on wood, adding it to the symphony of decay. Dinner is more johnny cakes and some dried venison that's tougher than you remember, that makes your jaw ache to chew. You have a small store of salt pork, but you're saving that for when things get truly desperate, though you're not sure anymore what separates difficult from desperate. The line keeps moving. As darkness comes, early still, though the days are lengthening, you tend the fire, banking it carefully for the night, trying to find the balance between warmth now and fuel later. You change into sleeping clothes that are only marginally drier than your day clothes, hanging the wet things near the fire but not too near. You lie down on your damp mattress and pull your damp blankets over you and listen to the cabin drip and settle. Your body aches in ways you're getting used to. Your lower back from bending and lifting, your feet from the constant cold and wet, your hands from gripping tools. You're not injured, not sick, not in any one crisis. You're just slowly being worn down by the accumulated weight of small, persistent discomforts. Sleep is slow to come. You think about tomorrow, which will look much like today. You'll check the walls, you'll coax the fire, you'll eat what you have, you'll try to keep things from falling apart faster than you can hold them together. You'll wait for the ground to dry, knowing it might not dry for weeks yet, that this muddy purgatory could stretch on longer than winter did. You think about the people who told you homesteading would be hard, and how you'd nodded thinking you understood, how winter had been brutal but somehow satisfying in its clarity. You were cold, you stayed alive, you won. But this slow dissolution of order, this patient betrayal of the ground beneath you, this is harder in a way you couldn't have anticipated. You think about how spring is supposed to mean hope, how the church calendars you saw back east marked it as resurrection and renewal. Out here, spring means mud. It means uncertainty. It means the rules you learned in winter no longer apply, and new rules are being written in real time, in wet earth that won't stay still. You finally drift towards sleep, and your last conscious thought is of the thaw, how you'd waited for it all winter, how you'd longed for it, and how now that it's here, you find yourself almost wishing for the cold to return. At least you knew how to survive that. At least the ground was solid then. At least the world stood still. There was a woman whose name appears in several letters preserved in a county historical society, written in the careful hand of someone who'd learned penmanship in a better place in a drier time. Her name was Sarah Mercer, and she arrived in the Wisconsin Territory in the autumn of 1847 with her husband Thomas and their 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 5. They came with hopes that were not unusual for their time, carried on promises of land and opportunity that seemed solid enough when written in the pages of Eastern newspapers. The journey itself had taken 6 weeks, first by rail to Chicago, then by wagon through settlements that grew increasingly sparse as they moved north and west. The letters she wrote during their first winter are filled with the expected hardships, but also with a kind of determined optimism. She describes the cabin Thomas built with help from neighbors, the stove they'd brought from Pennsylvania, the first snow that made the landscape beautiful in its way. She writes about how quickly the children adapted, how they learned to ice skate on the frozen creek, how the cold was fierce but manageable if you respected it and prepared properly. There's an almost pedagogical quality to these early letters, as if she's documenting not just events, but proof that their decision to come west had been sound. But the letters she wrote during the thaw tell a different story. The tone shifts, the confidence wavers, and between the lines you can sense something she doesn't quite name, a kind of creeping dread that comes not from any single disaster, but from the accumulation of small failures, of plans that couldn't be executed, of time that was supposed to be spent preparing for planting, but was instead consumed by simply holding what they had together. Sarah had been taught, as most settlers were, that survival on the frontier was a matter of hard work and proper planning. You stored enough food for winter, you built a sound shelter, you maintained your tools, and you endured until spring brought relief. This was the narrative, the promise, the contract with the land. But the thaw revealed something that the guidebooks and the land agents and the hopeful letters from successful homesteaders had failed to mention. That spring itself could be a kind of siege, longer and more demoralizing than winter, because it offered the illusion of improvement while delivering none. The deception was in the vocabulary itself, in the way words like thaw and spring carried associations from the eastern states that simply didn't apply here. In Pennsylvania, spring had meant crocuses pushing through softening earth, gentle rains that encouraged growth, a gradual warming that allowed for orderly transition from dormancy to cultivation. In the Wisconsin territory, spring meant something else entirely, a violent disruption of the frozen order that winter had imposed, a chaos of water that had nowhere to go, ground that couldn't decide whether it was solid or liquid. Sarah would later write that they'd come prepared for the wrong kind of spring, that all their assumptions had been shaped by a climate that bore little resemblance to what they found. In March of 1848, Sarah writes to her sister back in Pennsylvania, describing the snow beginning to melt. She uses words like finally and at last and thank Providence. She writes about how the children are eager to play outside without their heavy coats, how Thomas has been planning which fields to clear first, how they're all looking forward to fresh vegetables and the end of living on stored provisions. The letter is dated March 12th, and it contains hope. The next letter is dated April 23rd, more than a month later. Sarah apologizes for the delay, explaining that there has been no way to get mail to the settlement, that the roads have been impassable, that they've been essentially cut off from everyone. She describes how the ground around their cabin has turned to something that's neither solid earth nor water, but some uncertain state between. She writes about how their small barn, really just a lean-to built against the side of a hill, partially collapsed when the hillside itself began to move, sliding slowly downward under the weight of saturated soil. 3 of their chickens were crushed in that collapse. The others escaped, but wandered off into the woods, and despite the children's searching, only one was ever found. Sarah doesn't dwell on this loss, doesn't dramatize it, but she notes it carefully, the way someone keeps a ledger of diminishing assets. Chickens meant eggs, meant protein, meant something to trade. Their loss wasn't catastrophic, but it was one more subtraction from an account that couldn't afford many more withdrawals. In a separate letter to her mother, written around the same time but only discovered decades later in a different collection, Sarah calculates the economic impact of losing those chickens, not just the immediate loss of eggs, but the future loss of chicks they might have hatched, the compounding effect of the setback. Thomas had planned to begin ploughing as soon as the ground thawed. This was essential timing. Corn needed to be planted by late April or early May to have enough growing season before the first fall frost. Every farmer knew this, and the calendar was unforgiving. But the ground that was supposed to thaw into workable soil had instead become something impossible to plough. The blade would sink and stick, the ox would strain and slip, and nothing productive would result except exhaustion for both man and animal. Thomas had borrowed the ox from a neighbor who lived on higher ground, and each failed attempt to plough felt like a betrayal of that trust, a waste of the animal's strength that should have been preserved for work that actually accomplished something. Sarah describes watching Thomas attempt this day after day, trying different fields, different techniques, waiting for the sun to dry the earth enough to make it cooperative. But the sun, when it appeared at all, seemed to have no effect. The moisture was too deep, too thorough. The earth had been frozen for 4 months, and now all that ice was becoming water, and the water had nowhere to go except to sit there just beneath the surface, turning soil into something like cold soup. She writes in one letter about how deceptive the ground could be, how a patch might look solid, might even feel solid under your boot at first, but then your weight would break through some surface tension and you'd sink to your ankle or your knee. Walking from the cabin to the creek, a distance of perhaps 200 yards, could take 20 minutes and leave you exhausted from the constant effort of pulling your feet free. By the end of April, Thomas had managed to plough perhaps a quarter acre, less than a tenth of what they'd planned, what they needed. Sarah's letter doesn't express panic, but there's a tightness in the language, a careful control that suggests panic being held at bay through sheer force of will. She writes about how they're rationing their remaining cornmeal, how the children don't complain but are always hungry, how she's started foraging for anything edible, wild onions, last year's nuts, early shoots of plants she's only half certain are safe to eat. The cornmeal they'd bought in the settlement in November had seemed like a generous supply, enough to see them through winter with surplus, but they hadn't accounted for winter extending so far into what should have been spring. The isolation during the thaw was different from winter isolation. In winter, everyone was isolated together, locked in place by the same conditions. But in the thaw, the isolation was more random, more unpredictable. Some homesteads sat on higher ground and dried faster. Some had better drainage. Some were simply luckier in how the water flowed. Sarah writes about seeing smoke from the neighbor's chimney 3/4 of a mile away and having no way to reach them, no way to know if they were faring better or worse, no way to share resources or labor or even just conversation. The smoke became a kind of torment, proof that others existed, proof that she and her family weren't alone in the landscape, but proof too that the distance between them might as well have been measured in miles as in yards. Her daughter, the 5-year-old whose name was Margaret, developed a cough in early April. Sarah describes it as nothing serious at first, just the kind of thing children get. But the cough persisted, then worsened, became something that kept the child awake at night and left her tired and listless during the day. Sarah treated it with what she had: honey, steam from hot water, rest. But the cabin was damp, perpetually damp, the air inside thick with moisture that never seemed to leave. The child's clothes were damp, her bedding was damp, and the cough settled into her chest and wouldn't let go. Sarah writes about hanging laundry near the stove and having it still damp the next day, about how bread wouldn't rise properly in the humid air, about how everything felt clammy to the touch. The dampness wasn't just uncomfortable, it was invasive, a presence that affected everything, that made small tasks harder and big problems worse. By late April, Sarah's letters mention the cough in every paragraph, the way a hand keeps returning to an aching tooth. She describes holding Margaret through the night, feeling the rattle in the child's breathing, praying that it would break, that the weather would clear, that something would change. Thomas wanted to ride for the doctor, but the doctor was in the settlement 15 miles away, and the route there crossed 2 swollen creeks and a low valley that had become a temporary marsh. The risk of attempting the journey was high, and what if he made it there only to find the doctor was out on another call, or couldn't return with him because his own horse had gone lame, or any of the 1,000 things that could go wrong? So they waited, and they treated the child as best they could, and Sarah's letters from this period become shorter, more terse, as if she couldn't spare the energy for detailed description. She mentions that Thomas has given up on ploughing for now. She mentions that they're eating less to make the food stretch. She mentions that the rain continues, intermittent but frequent, never quite stopping long enough for anything to dry. Her son, whose name was William, appears more frequently in the letters from this period, helping his father with what work could be done, keeping his sister company when Sarah needed to step away. At 8 years old, he was trying to be useful, trying to be a man, and Sarah writes with a mixture of pride and heartbreak about watching him attempt tasks that would have been difficult for someone twice his age. And then there's a gap in the letters. Nothing for 3 weeks. When Sarah writes again, in mid-May, she apologizes for the silence, but doesn't explain it directly. She mentions that Margaret is recovered now, is playing outside again, is helping with small chores. She mentions it the way you might mention that a storm has passed, stating the fact without revisiting the fear. Only at the end of the letter does she add, almost as an afterthought, that there were several nights when she wasn't sure the child would make it to morning. The recovery of Margaret coincided with a change in the weather, a week of clear skies and steady wind that finally began to pull the moisture from the ground. Thomas was able to plough another acre, working from dawn to dusk, pushing himself and the ox to make up for lost time. But they both knew they were behind, that their planting was happening weeks later than it should, that the margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. Sarah writes about the tension in the household during this period, how every hour of good weather felt precious and every passing cloud felt like a threat. Sarah's June letters describe a kind of frantic activity. Thomas planting whatever he can, wherever the ground is dry enough. Sarah tending a kitchen garden that she's managed to establish in a raised bed, built with stones and logs to lift it above the wet ground. The children helping where they can, carrying water, pulling weeds, chasing birds away from the seed. Everyone working with the unspoken knowledge that this year's harvest will determine whether they stay or whether they join the families who've already given up and moved back east, defeated not by winter but by spring. She mentions in one letter that 3 families from their general area had already abandoned their claims by early June, their cabins left empty, their cleared fields reverting to wilderness. There's a letter from July where Sarah describes the corn beginning to come up, the small green shoots pushing through the soil, and you can feel the relief in her words, the sense that perhaps they'll make it after all. But the relief is tempered, cautious. She's learned not to trust hope too readily. She's learned that the frontier gives and takes in ways that don't follow the rules she grew up with. She writes about checking the corn twice a day, looking for signs of disease or pest damage, counting the stalks as if the numbers themselves could provide security. Thomas had planted in scattered patches rather than in orderly rows, planting wherever the ground was workable, which meant their fields looked chaotic compared to the neat agricultural geometry they'd known in Pennsylvania. The letters continue through that summer and into autumn. The harvest comes, smaller than they'd hoped, but enough, just enough. They manage to put away sufficient stores for the next winter, pay off some debts, hold on. But something in Sarah's tone has changed. The optimism from that first winter never quite returns. In its place is something steadier, more realistic, harder to break, but also harder to lift into joy. She writes about her changing relationship with the seasons, how she no longer looks forward to spring with simple anticipation, but with a complex mixture of hope and wariness. The thaw had taught her that transitions could be more dangerous than extremes, that the in-between times demanded a different kind of vigilance. In a letter from September, she reflects on what she calls the muddy months, and she writes something that seems to capture the psychological toll of the thaw better than any dramatic account of disaster might. She writes, "I find now that I cannot fully celebrate spring the way I once did. Some part of me remains braced for disappointment, waiting for the ground to betray its solidity. I know this is perhaps unfair to the season, but the heart learns its lessons whether the mind approves or not. Thomas appears less in the later letters, not because he's absent, but because Sarah seems to write less about external events and more about internal states. She describes how the thaw taught her something about patience she hadn't known before, not the patient endurance of waiting for a desired outcome, but the patience of accepting that some things cannot be controlled, cannot be prepared for, can only be endured and adapted to. She writes about how she's learned to read the land differently, to notice the subtle variations in elevation that mean the difference between workable ground and impassable mud, to respect the ways the water moves, and to build her plans around its logic, rather than her own wishes. In one particularly reflective letter, she notes that Thomas has become quieter, more internal, that the experience of that first thaw changed something in him that she can't quite name, but can feel in the way he moves through the world now. By their third year in Wisconsin, Sarah's letters show a family that has survived, that has learned, that has adapted. They've built a second, larger cabin on higher ground, abandoning the first when they could afford to. They've expanded their cleared land, diversified their crops, established relationships with neighbors that allow for mutual support during difficult times. They've become, in other words, frontier settlers in the fullest sense, people who understand the land's terms and have learned to meet them. The new cabin sits on a rise that seemed insignificant when they first arrived, but which they now recognize as crucial, perhaps 15 feet higher than their original site, but that elevation makes all the difference. Sarah writes about the satisfaction of watching the spring thaw from their new vantage point, seeing the water pool in the low areas while their own ground remains workable. But Sarah never forgets those first thaw months. In a letter written years later to a cousin who's considering moving west, she includes a long section about the thaw, warning her relative in terms that are neither discouraging nor encouraging, but simply honest. She describes how the guidebooks talk about winter and summer, but rarely mention the between times, the transitions that can be harder than the extremes. She tells her cousin to bring more food than seems necessary, to build on high ground if at all possible, to not assume that spring means the hard part is over. The advice is specific and practical. She recommends particular tools, particular supplies, particular attitudes. She tells her cousin to expect that the first year will be about learning rather than prospering, that every mistake is expensive, that the land will teach its lessons slowly and without mercy. The final letter in the collection is dated 1859, more than a decade after Sarah's arrival. She's writing to that same sister back in Pennsylvania, and she mentions almost casually that they've just come through another difficult thaw, though not as bad as some they've experienced. She describes it the way someone might describe an unpleasant but familiar neighbor, with resignation and a kind of wary respect. The mud returns each year, she writes, and each year we are a little better prepared for it, though I think we will never entirely master it. The land keeps its secrets and yields them slowly, teaching us patience whether we wish to learn it or not. In the same letter, she mentions that William, now 20, is planning to claim his own land to the north, and that she's been sharing with him everything she's learned, hoping to spare him some of the hardest lessons, while knowing that the land will teach him its own way regardless. What's striking about Sarah's account preserved across these letters is not any single moment of drama or crisis. There's no climactic disaster, no narrow escape, no clear turning point where everything changed. Instead, there's the slow accumulation of difficulty, the grinding work of holding things together when they want to fall apart, the psychological weight of uncertainty that stretches across weeks and months. It's the kind of hardship that doesn't make for exciting stories, but that shapes lives nonetheless, that teaches lessons about resilience that are quieter but perhaps more lasting than the lessons of more dramatic trials. Thomas Mercer died in 1862, kicked by a horse. Sarah lived another 23 years, eventually seeing her children grown and settled on their own land. In her later letters, she sometimes mentions the early years, the years of struggle, and there's a quality to her reminiscences that suggests those difficulties forged something in her that later comforts could never quite soften. She'd learned what she was capable of, what could be endured, what mattered, and what didn't. The thaw had been her education, more thorough than winter, and she'd passed its examinations not with triumph, but with persistence. Margaret, the daughter who'd nearly died that first spring, married a farmer from the next county and had 6 children of her own, and Sarah writes about visiting her and seeing how her daughter builds her life on slightly higher ground, how she stores extra food, how she's absorbed lessons she doesn't consciously remember learning. The County Historical Society that preserves these letters notes in its catalogue that Sarah Mercer's correspondence is remarkable for its detail and honesty, that it provides an unusually complete picture of frontier domestic life. But what makes the letters truly valuable is how they capture not just events, but the emotional texture of those events, the way hope and fear coexist, the way daily tedium can be as challenging as acute crisis, the way survival is often not about grand gestures but about small, repeated acts of maintenance and care. The archivist who catalogued the collection in the 1930s noted in her annotations that Sarah's letters had been preserved by the sister in Pennsylvania, who'd kept them in a wooden box and passed them to her own daughter, who eventually donated them to the Historical Society. The letters had been read and reread, the paper soft from handling, evidence that Sarah's words had mattered to people beyond their immediate practical purpose. Reading Sarah's letters now, more than a century and a half later, what emerges is a portrait of spring that complicates our assumptions. We think of spring as renewal, as the easy season, as the reward for enduring winter. But for Sarah and Thomas and countless others on the frontier, spring meant uncertainty, meant mud, meant a different kind of test that asked different questions and demanded different strengths. They survived it not because they were exceptional, but because they adjusted their expectations, learned from their failures, and accepted that the land would teach them on its own schedule, in its own language, through lessons written in mud and water and disappointed hopes. And perhaps that's the real story of the Thaw, not any individual's triumph or tragedy, but the collective experience of a generation learning to read a landscape that didn't match their expectations, learning to survive not just the extremes of weather but the difficult in-between times, the muddy months that no one had warned them about, the spring that arrived not as deliverance but as a different kind of trial altogether. These were people who'd been trained in one kind of patience, the patience of following established agricultural practices, of trusting in seasonal rhythms that had held true for generations, and who found themselves needing an entirely different kind of patience, one that accepted the fundamental uncertainty of their new environment and built resilience from that acceptance rather than from confidence. The historical record shows that the Mercer family's experience was far from unique. Other letters from the same period, preserved in archives across the upper Midwest, tell similar stories with different details but the same underlying structure. Winter bringing hardship but clarity, spring bringing hope but betrayal, survival requiring not heroic effort but sustained adaptation. One neighbor's account, preserved in a diary now held by the Wisconsin Historical Society, describes the same spring of 1848 and mentions the Mercers by name, noting that they were struggling as we all are, learning as we all must. The diarist, a man named Peters, describes attempting to help Thomas with ploughing and finding that 2 men and 2 oxen could accomplish no more than 1 man alone. The ground simply wouldn't cooperate, and additional effort produced no additional results. What unites these accounts is a sense of having been fundamentally unprepared not for hardship itself, but for the specific nature of that hardship. The settlers who came to Wisconsin in the 1840s weren't naive. They knew frontier life would be difficult, but they'd prepared for the wrong difficulties, anticipated the wrong challenges, packed the wrong solutions. They'd brought plows designed for Pennsylvania soil and found them useless in Wisconsin mud. They'd brought expectations shaped by eastern seasons and found them irrelevant to Midwestern weather. They'd brought confidence earned through competence in one environment and discovered it meant nothing in another. Sarah's particular contribution to this historical chorus is the clarity with which she articulates the psychological dimension of this mismatch. Other accounts focus on the physical challenges, the measurements of rainfall, the dates of planting, the calculations of yield. Sarah's letters certainly include these practical details, but they also capture something harder to quantify: the erosion of certainty, the accommodation to doubt, the recalibration of identity that comes from discovering you don't know as much as you thought you did. She writes in one letter about feeling like a child again, having to learn basic things from scratch, except that when you're a child you expect to not know, whereas as an adult, the admission of ignorance carries a different weight. The land itself was neither cruel nor kind. It simply operated according to its own logic, a logic shaped by geology and climate and hydrology that had nothing to do with human hopes or plans. The prairie soil of Wisconsin, deposited by glaciers and modified by millennia of grass growth, behaved differently from the forest soils of Pennsylvania. It held water differently, froze differently, thawed differently. The settlers didn't know this initially because they couldn't. This was knowledge that could only be gained through experience, through seasons lived rather than read about, through mistakes made and consequences endured. Sarah writes eloquently about this slow accumulation of practical knowledge, about learning to read signs in the landscape that meant nothing to her during their first months. The way certain grasses grew only in spots with good drainage, the way the snow accumulated differently on north-facing versus south-facing slopes, the way the creek's sound changed when it was carrying snowmelt versus rain runoff. These were subtle indicators invisible to the uninitiated, but essential to anyone hoping to thrive rather than merely survive. By their 5th year, Sarah could look at the land in March and predict with reasonable accuracy which areas would be workable by late April and which would remain problematic into May. The community that slowly coalesced around the settlement played a crucial role in this education. Settlers who arrived earlier passed knowledge to those who came later. Families who failed and departed left lessons embedded in their abandoned cabins and overgrown fields. Sarah writes about a gathering in the summer of 1850, a kind of informal assembly where families shared what they'd learned, trading information about which seeds worked best, which building techniques withstood the weather, which foraging plants were safe and which were dangerous. This collective knowledge, built from individual experiences and pooled for common benefit, represented a kind of curriculum, the frontier teaching itself to its inhabitants through a distributed, experiential pedagogy. Yet even with this shared wisdom, each family's experience remained unique because each claim sat on slightly different ground, faced slightly different conditions, operated within slightly different constraints. Sarah's friend, a woman named Catherine who lived 2 miles east, had an entirely different Thaw experience because her cabin sat on sandy soil that drained quickly. Catherine's letters, which Sarah occasionally mentions, apparently described spring in almost cheerful terms. Muddy, yes, but workable, manageable. Sarah writes about feeling both glad for her friend's good fortune and envious of it, acknowledging the unfairness of this reaction while not being able to entirely dismiss it. The social dynamics of the settlement were complicated by these variations in fortune. Families who'd lucked into better land could appear more capable, more diligent, more blessed, when in fact their success often came down to factors beyond their control. Sarah writes about a neighbor who openly criticized families who'd failed and moved back east, attributing their departure to weak character or insufficient faith, and she notes acidly that this neighbor's claim sat atop a gravel bed with excellent drainage. She learned to be suspicious of easy judgments, to recognize how much of what looked like virtue or failure was actually just luck, good or bad placement, fortuitous or unfortunate timing, the countless uncontrollable variables that determined whether a family prospered or struggled. Margaret's recovery from that near-fatal illness left traces that persisted for years. She remained more susceptible to respiratory problems, would develop bronchitis at the slightest provocation, seemed to carry in her lungs the memory of that first thaw. Sarah writes about this in later years with a kind of resigned protectiveness, noting that her daughter learned to be cautious about damp conditions, learned to recognize early warning signs in her own breathing, learned to manage a vulnerability that had been written into her body by circumstance. The experience made Margaret more aware of her mortality perhaps than other children her age, gave her a seriousness that Sarah sometimes found troubling but couldn't deny had its uses. William, by contrast, seemed to take from those early years a kind of practical stoicism. Sarah's letters describe him as someone who expected difficulty, planned for setbacks, moved through life with a wariness that sometimes looked like pessimism but was really just realism. When he established his own claim in 1862, he chose his land carefully, spent weeks evaluating different sites, prioritized drainage and elevation over other considerations. Sarah writes that she sees in her son the crystallization of lessons learned, that he carries the Thaw forward into his own life not as trauma but as useful knowledge. The economic precarity of those first years cast long shadows. Even after the Mercers had achieved a measure of stability, Sarah's letters reveal a persistent anxiety about resources, a tendency to over-prepare, to store more food than necessary, to maintain larger reserves than strictly rational. She writes about recognizing this tendency in herself, understanding it as a response to those months when they'd watched their supplies dwindle with no clear prospect of replenishment but being unable to entirely overcome it. The Thaw had taught her that margins of safety could evaporate faster than anticipated, that abundance could transform into scarcity in the space of weeks, and that lesson remained written into her habits and reflexes. Thomas's death in 1862 comes abruptly in the historical record, mentioned in one letter and then absorbed into Sarah's ongoing narrative. She doesn't dwell on it, doesn't dramatize it, approaches it with the same clear-eyed pragmatism she'd developed during the Thaw. She had to manage the farm alone for several months before William could arrange to take it over, and her letters from this period show someone operating with competence, born from years of accumulated experience. She knew what needed to be done, knew how to read the land and the weather, knew how to make decisions about planting and harvesting and maintenance. The Thaw had been her first teacher on the frontier, but the years since had provided continuous education, and by 1862 she was fluent in the land's language in ways that would have seemed impossible during that first desperate spring. She writes about experiencing grief for Thomas while simultaneously managing the practical demands of the farm, about how these two states coexisted, how loss didn't excuse her from the ongoing work of survival. In her final years, living with Margaret's family, after William had taken over the original Mercer claim, Sarah's letters take on a reflective quality. She writes less about daily events and more about patterns observed over decades, about changes in the settlement that had become a town, about the gradual transformation of wilderness into domesticated landscape. She notes that the new settlers arriving in the 1870s and 1880s found a much more forgiving environment than she had, not because the land had changed, but because the community had developed infrastructure and knowledge that made the transition easier. There were gristmills now, stores that carried supplies through the winter, doctors within reasonable distance, roads that were maintained and passable during the Thaw. Yet she also observes that these new settlers sometimes lacked the depth of understanding that came from harder experience. They could follow established patterns without necessarily understanding why those patterns existed, could achieve success without developing the same kind of resilience that earlier generations had been forced to cultivate. Sarah doesn't present this as criticism. She's glad that others can have easier lives, but there's a sense that something has been lost in the translation, that the land's lessons are being learned less thoroughly by people who don't face the same stark consequences for ignorance. She writes that she wouldn't wish her early struggles on anyone, yet she also acknowledges that those struggles gave her something valuable, some hard-won knowledge about herself and about survival that shapes how she moves through the world. The letters end not with any dramatic conclusion, but simply trail off. The last preserved correspondence dated 1885, a short note to her sister mentioning spring planting and family news. Sarah died that same year, and the historical record notes that she was buried next to Thomas in the cemetery that had grown up around the original settlement's church. The Historical Society's catalogue entry notes that Sarah's grave is still visitable, that the cemetery is maintained by the local Historical Preservation Committee, that visitors interested in frontier history sometimes seek it out. The gravestone is simple: her name, her dates, and no particular epitaph beyond the conventional formulas of the time. But in a sense, the letters themselves serve as her epitaph, not proclaiming any grand achievement or virtue, but simply documenting a life lived with honesty and attention, recording the texture of experience in a time and place that demanded constant adaptation. They preserve not just Sarah's individual story, but the story of a particular kind of American experience, of people learning to live in a landscape that didn't accommodate itself to their expectations, that insisted they accommodate themselves to it instead. The muddy months of that first spring, so thoroughly documented in Sarah's correspondence, represent more than just a seasonal difficulty or a historical footnote. They represent a kind of education that shaped not just individual lives, but the character of entire communities, a forced reckoning with the gap between expectation and reality that transformed settlers into something else, not conquerors of the wilderness, as the rhetoric of their time often suggested, but rather students of it, people who survived by learning to listen to what the land was teaching them rather than insisting it conform to what they already knew. And perhaps that is what makes these letters valuable beyond their documentary function. They preserve a quality of attention, a willingness to observe and record and reflect on experience that allows us, more than a century later, to understand something about the actual texture of frontier life rather than its mythology, to see the spring thaw not as a minor inconvenience between winter and planting, but as its own season, with its own character and demands and lessons, a time that tested people in ways they hadn't anticipated and taught them things they couldn't have learned any other way. There's a peculiar pattern in the historical record that becomes visible only when you look across many sources, many years, many voices. Settlers kept diaries, wrote letters, filed reports with land offices and territorial governments, creating an archive of experience that spans decades and thousands of miles of frontier territory. And in these documents, when they describe the difficulties of frontier life, winter appears again and again. The cold, the isolation, the constant need for fuel and food. The harsh months are documented in painful detail, with accounts of frostbite and hunger, of livestock lost to blizzards, of children huddled near inadequate stoves while wind tore through gaps in hastily built walls. But when they describe their failures, their moments of genuine despair, their decisions to abandon homesteads and return east, spring appears far more often than you might expect. The season that should have brought relief instead brought a different kind of crisis, one that settlers seemed less prepared to face than winter's obvious brutality. Why would the season of renewal drive people to give up? Why would the thaw, the thing they'd waited for, through months of frozen darkness, become the breaking point more often than winter itself? The answer lies partly in the soil, in the very ground beneath their feet, and in a process that settlers understood only through bitter experience, never through formal education. They came to the frontier with agricultural knowledge inherited from Europe, from regions where the freeze-thaw cycle was gentler, where the ground's seasonal transformations were less dramatic, less destructive to human ambitions. What happens to Earth when it freezes for months and then melts is not simply a return to its previous state. The transformation is more complex, more destructive, and more difficult to predict than anyone who hadn't witnessed it could imagine. When water freezes, it expands. This is familiar knowledge now, something we learn in school alongside other basic facts about the physical world, but the implications of this expansion for soil structure are profound and were poorly understood by 19th century settlers. All through the winter months, moisture in the ground, moisture from autumn rains, from early snows, from the water table beneath, was slowly crystallizing, slowly forming ice lenses within the soil, slowly pushing particles apart and disrupting the cohesion that gave the ground its stability. This process happened invisibly beneath the surface, accumulating force and consequence, while the world above remained frozen and apparently stable. A frozen field looks solid. You can walk across it, drive a wagon over it, build structures upon it with confidence, never suspecting that the ground beneath your feet is undergoing a transformation that will reshape everything come spring. But beneath that frozen surface, the soil structure is being quietly dismantled. The ice is creating spaces where none existed before, pushing clay and sand and organic matter into new configurations, breaking the bonds between particles that give soil its load-bearing capacity, its ability to support weight without shifting or collapsing. When the thaw comes, what melts is not just the surface snow, but these internal ice structures, and the ground doesn't simply return to its pre-winter state. It collapses into something looser, wetter, less stable. The spaces created by ice become filled with water, and the soil particles that were pushed apart cannot immediately return to their previous arrangement, leaving the ground in a state of temporary suspension, neither solid nor liquid, but something in between. This process has a name now: frost heaving and thaw consolidation. Engineers study it, plan for it, build roads and foundations with it in mind, incorporating drainage systems and frost-resistant materials to minimize the damage that freeze-thaw cycles inevitably cause. But the frontier settlers had no such knowledge. They knew only that the ground betrayed them each spring, that structures built on frozen earth would shift and sink, that fields that seemed level would reveal themselves to be anything but once the thaw came, creating new challenges for plowing and planting just when the growing season demanded immediate action. Archaeological surveys of abandoned homestead sites reveal this pattern with remarkable consistency. Corner posts of cabins show differential settling. One corner sunk 6 inches deeper than the others, creating the structural stresses that would eventually tear the building apart, splitting logs and causing roofs to sag under their own weight. Fence lines appear in layers of soil like geological strata, each line representing an attempt to establish boundaries, each one eventually swallowed by the ground as it shifted and settled. These parallel lines, visible in excavation, tell stories of repeated effort, of settlers trying year after year to maintain property lines despite the earth's refusal to stay still. Wells collapse inward, their carefully stacked stone walls tumbling as the earth around them loses coherence. The archaeological evidence shows stones scattered at angles, the circular structure that took days to build reduced to rubble by forces the builders never fully understood. There's a site in Minnesota excavated in the 1970s that tells this story with particular clarity. The remains of a cabin built in 1852 and abandoned by 1855 show clear evidence of catastrophic settling that must have made the structure increasingly uninhabitable with each passing year. The northeastern corner post, the one that would have borne the most weight from the roof, sunk nearly 18 inches into the ground over just 3 spring seasons. The archaeologists found it tilted at a 40-degree angle, still partially preserved in the wet soil that had claimed it, the wood darkened but not yet completely decomposed after more than a century in the anaerobic conditions of saturated ground. The cabin's occupants had tried to compensate, wedging stones and lumber beneath the sagging corner, but you can see in the archaeological record that these fixes were temporary, that each spring brought new settling, new problems, new evidence that the structure was losing its battle with the ground. Layers of supporting material tell a story of escalating desperation, of people trying to save an investment they couldn't afford to lose. What's haunting about sites like this is imagining the slow realization that must have come to the occupants. The first spring, perhaps, they thought it was just bad luck, just their particular piece of ground. maybe a hidden pocket of clay, or an underground spring they hadn't detected when they built in the previous autumn. The second spring, they would have known it was something more systematic, more persistent. Perhaps they talked to neighbors and learned that others were experiencing similar problems, that this was a feature of the land itself, not just their misfortune. By the third spring, they would have understood that they were trying to build permanent structures on fundamentally impermanent ground, that the very earth beneath them was in a constant cycle of freezing and melting, expanding and contracting. That stability was an illusion that lasted only as long as the temperature stayed below freezing. This understanding must have been crushing, the realization that years of work might be undone not by dramatic disaster, but by the quiet, persistent physics of water-changing state. But soil mechanics tell only part of the story. The other element that made spring so treacherous was water. Not just the water that came from melting snow, but the water that was already in the ground, the water table that rose dramatically as winter's ice became spring's liquid, seeking any available space, filling the voids created by frost heaving, saturating soil that had been relatively dry in autumn. Hydrologists studying historical settlement patterns have noted something curious. The homesteads that succeeded were almost always on ground with specific drainage characteristics, subtle slopes that allowed water to move away from structures, soil compositions that allowed for percolation rather than surface pooling, elevations that put them just high enough above the water table to avoid the worst of the spring saturation. These characteristics, invisible to casual observation, made the difference between success and failure, between a homestead that lasted generations and one abandoned after a few miserable years. But settlers choosing land in autumn or early winter had no way to assess these characteristics. The ground was dry or frozen, and it looked solid, looked promising, gave no hint of where the water would go when it had to go somewhere, when the accumulated moisture of an entire winter's snowfall tried to move through soil and across landscape in the space of a few weeks. Indigenous peoples of the Northern Plains and Great Lakes region had, of course, already solved this problem through centuries of observation and adaptation. Their seasonal movements were not arbitrary or simply nomadic. They were responses to the land's cycles, to the predictable but profound changes that came with each season, to the knowledge that different times of year required different relationships with the landscape. Winter camps were often in river valleys where wood for fuel was abundant and some protection from wind could be found. The valleys, dangerous during spring floods, became havens during winter, their sheltered character more valuable than elevation when the primary concerns were cold and wind. But spring camps moved to higher ground, to ridges and hills where the earth dried faster, where structures wouldn't sink, where the worst of the mud could be avoided. This wasn't random wandering but sophisticated environmental management, a system refined over generations to minimize hardship and maximize efficiency. Settlers, arriving with European agricultural traditions developed in climates with gentler freeze-thaw cycles, with longer histories of permanent settlement, missed these lessons entirely. They built where they claimed land, regardless of elevation or drainage, constrained by property boundaries that existed on maps but had no relationship to the land's actual characteristics. They assumed that the ground's behavior in October would match its behavior in April. They'd learned otherwise, but the learning came at enormous cost, in failed structures, in missed planting seasons, in the grinding work of compensating for mistakes that couldn't be easily fixed once foundations were laid and crops were in the ground. There's a journal kept by a surveyor working in the Wisconsin Territory in the 1840s that captures this cultural blindness with painful clarity. He describes meeting an elderly Ojibwe man who watched him marking out township boundaries, establishing section corners, designating lands for settlement according to the grid system that would eventually cover the entire frontier. The surveyor asked, through an interpreter, whether the elder thought the land was good for farming. The elder's response, as recorded in the journal, was, "In what season do you ask?" The surveyor didn't understand the question at first, thought perhaps it was a translation issue. But the elder persisted. "The land is many things," he said. "It changes with the seasons, and some ground that seems solid becomes impassable. Some places that seem promising in autumn will be underwater in spring, and you cannot judge land by looking at it in only one moment of its yearly cycle." The surveyor noted this in his journal but doesn't seem to have given it much weight. He was marking sections based on the grid system established by the land ordinance, lines drawn on maps without reference to topography or hydrology, straight lines that made sense for legal purposes but had no connection to how water moved or where soil was stable. The settlers who would come later would choose their homesteads based on these abstract sections, on what looked good on paper or what was available when they arrived, and they would discover one spring at a time what the Ojibwe elder already knew. The lessons would be expensive, measured in failed crops and collapsed buildings, and the exhausting labor of trying to farm land that spent weeks each year, too wet to plow. Archaeological evidence of indigenous seasonal sites shows a sophisticated understanding of micro-topography and drainage. Spring and summer camps are consistently on rises, on sandy soils that drain quickly, on locations that modern soil surveys would classify as well-drained or excessively drained, classifications that would have meant nothing to 19th century settlers, but that represented crucial survival knowledge. These weren't accidents. This was knowledge built over generations, knowledge that saved enormous labor and hardship, knowledge that was available but rarely sought by settlers who assumed their own traditions were superior, who saw seasonal movement as primitive rather than as an adaptation to environmental reality. The mystery, perhaps, is not why the thaw was so difficult, but why settlers took so long to learn what the land was trying to teach them. Part of the answer lies in the ideology of settlement itself, the belief that the land could and should be made to conform to human needs, that proper European farming techniques would triumph over environmental challenges, that permanent settlement and year-round occupation of a single site was not just preferable but morally superior to seasonal movement. There's a letter written by a land agent in 1851 that reveals this ideology in stark terms. He's responding to complaints from settlers about spring conditions, about impassable roads and flooded fields, about the difficulty of getting crops planted when the ground was either frozen solid or reduced to impassable mud, with only a few days between these states when planting was actually possible. His advice is essentially to work harder, to dig more drainage ditches, to persevere until the land is properly improved. The possibility that the land's seasonal behavior might require adaptation rather than improvement doesn't seem to occur to him, or, if it does occur to him, he dismisses it as a kind of surrender to wilderness, an admission of defeat that contradicts the entire premise of westward expansion. The settlers, he implies, simply need to be more industrious, more determined, more willing to impose order on the chaos of unimproved wilderness. The letter reads as if determination alone could overcome hydrology, as if sufficient willpower could make water flow uphill or prevent frost from penetrating soil. But the chaos wasn't chaos, it was a pattern, a cycle, a rhythm that the land had followed for millennia. The water went where it had always gone, following gravity and soil permeability, collecting in the same low spots that had collected water for thousands of years. The soil behaved as it had always behaved, freezing when temperatures dropped, heaving when ice formed, collapsing when ice melted. The only thing that was new was the expectation that it should behave differently, that human structures built without reference to these patterns would somehow prevail through sheer will and hard work. Modern soil conservation practices developed in the early 20th century, after the lessons of the Dust Bowl and decades of agricultural failure, finally began to incorporate the kind of knowledge that indigenous peoples had always possessed. Contour ploughing, terracing, strategic placement of structures based on drainage patterns, understanding of soil composition and its relationship to water retention, these became standard practice, but only after generations of farmers learned through failure what might have been learned through humility, through asking rather than assuming. There's a kind of melancholy in reading the archaeological reports of abandoned homesteads, in seeing the evidence of so much wasted effort, so much hardship that might have been avoided. The carefully stacked stone foundations sunk into mud, each stone placed with care and hope, now tilted at angles that tell of the ground's betrayal. The fence posts at angles that suggest the slow surrender of vertical to horizontal. The layers of attempted fixes, boards wedged here, stones piled there, each one a moment of hope that this time this solution would hold, would work, would finally stabilize what couldn't be stabilized without first understanding the ground's true nature. Geologists studying historical settlement patterns have created maps that overlay modern soil surveys with records of homestead abandonment. The correlation is striking and would be obvious to anyone with both data sets, but settlers had only their own observations and whatever advice they could get from neighbors who often knew little more than they did. Sites on poorly drained soils, on ground classified as having severe limitations for building, show abandonment rates 3 to 4 times higher than sites on well-drained soils. The data is there, visible in retrospect, but it was invisible to settlers who had no way to read the subtle signs that soil scientists now know to look for. The types of vegetation that indicate high water tables, the slight depressions that become seasonal ponds, the clay content that determines how soil will behave when saturated. The thaw was difficult not just because of what it did to the ground, but because of what it revealed about the limits of knowledge and preparation. You could work hard, plan carefully, build soundly by the standards you knew, follow all the advice available in agricultural manuals written for different climates and different soils, and still find yourself defeated by something as simple as water following gravity, as earth responding to temperature, as the inevitable physics of freezing and melting. In a way, the thaw was the frontier's great teacher, more effective than winter because it punished not just the unprepared but the misprepared, not just the lazy but the industrious who were working from incorrect assumptions. Winter was brutal but straightforward. If you had enough wood, enough food, adequate shelter, you could survive it through endurance. It taught humility to those who survived it, or it broke those who couldn't learn. It sorted settlers into those who could adapt their expectations to match reality, and those who insisted reality conformed to their expectations. And this sorting process played out over years, sometimes over generations. There's a moment captured in a missionary's journal from 1856 that seems to crystallize this lesson. He describes visiting a settler family in April, arriving to find them trying to repair their cabin, which had shifted so badly it was no longer square, the door frame twisted so the door wouldn't close properly, gaps opening between logs that had been tightly fitted just 2 years earlier. The father was exhausting himself trying to force the structure back into alignment, jacking up corners, removing and replacing timbers, working from dawn to dusk in increasingly desperate attempts to restore what had been. His hands were raw, his face haggard, and the missionary could see that the man was driving himself toward collapse, unable to accept that his labor was futile. The missionary, who'd been in the territory longer and had learned some hard lessons himself, tried to suggest that perhaps the cabin was built in the wrong place, that perhaps it would be better to build anew on higher ground rather than continue fighting ground that would never be stable. The suggestion was met with anger at first, the natural response of someone being told their suffering has been unnecessary. The settler's response, as recorded in the journal, was telling. "I've already put so much work into this place, I can't just abandon it." The missionary wrote that he understood the feeling, but also understood that sometimes the work already invested is not a reason to continue, but a lesson about what not to do next time. "The land," he wrote, "is patient and will teach the same lesson every year until we learn it. We can choose to learn quickly or slowly, but we cannot choose not to learn." Archaeological sites show this dynamic playing out across the landscape. Some homesteads show one cabin, then a second built nearby but on higher ground, evidence of learning, of adaptation, of settlers who recognized their mistake and corrected it while they still had the resources and energy to start over. Others show multiple attempts to fix the same structure in the same location, layers of effort trying to overcome a fundamental problem of placement. These sites are particularly poignant because you can see the escalation, the increasing desperation, the point where repair efforts became more elaborate than the original construction. And some show abandonment after 1 or 2 seasons, the occupants presumably either moving elsewhere or giving up on frontier life entirely. These sites often show minimal development, suggesting that the settlers recognized quickly that their situation was untenable and departed before investing more years in a doomed enterprise. What these sites collectively suggest is that the Thaw was a kind of examination, administered annually, with questions that couldn't be answered through determination alone. The land asked, "Do you understand where water goes? Do you know what frozen ground will do when it melts? Can you read the subtle signs that separate stable ground from treacherous? Can you adapt your plans to conditions rather than expecting conditions to adapt to your plans?" Some passed this examination, many didn't, and the failures were written in mud, in shifted foundations, in collapsed structures, in abandoned dreams, creating an archaeological record that speaks across centuries about the cost of misunderstanding one's environment. The mystery of the Thaw, then, is not really a mystery at all. It's a story about knowledge, about which knowledge was valued, which was ignored, which was learned slowly through suffering, and which was already there, waiting to be asked for, waiting in the observations of people who knew the land intimately because they'd lived with it on its own terms for generations. The settlers who succeeded were often those who learned to ask questions, to observe carefully, to set aside assumptions in favor of evidence. They were the ones who noticed where indigenous peoples camped in spring and chose similar ground for their own structures, recognizing that this knowledge had value even if they didn't initially understand the reasoning behind it. They were the ones who watched how water moved during the thaw and planned accordingly, observing the landscape during its most revealing season and making decisions based on what they saw rather than what they hoped. They were the ones who accepted that the land had its own logic, its own rhythms, and that human plans needed to harmonize with these rather than override them. But this learning process took time, took generations, took the accumulated failures of thousands of homesteads. The knowledge eventually became common, became part of the folk wisdom of rural life. Don't build in low spots, watch where the water goes, wait for the ground to firm up before plowing. Understand that spring is a time of transition and uncertainty. These lessons seem obvious now, self-evident to anyone who thinks about them, but they were purchased at enormous cost, paid in hardship and disappointment and the quiet grief of abandoned hopes. Every rule of thumb, every piece of folk wisdom about where to build and when to plant, represented someone's failure, someone's loss, someone's painful education in the realities of frontier life. And perhaps that's the real lesson of the thaw, not about soil mechanics or hydrology, but about the cost of not listening, of not learning from those who already know, of insisting that determination can overcome misunderstanding. The European tradition of agriculture, successful in its own context, became a liability when transplanted to a radically different environment without adaptation. The ground, patient and implacable, taught the same lesson every spring and would continue teaching it until the lesson was finally learned. Some learned quickly, recognizing within a season or two that their approach needed to change, that the land required different methods than they'd brought with them from the East or from Europe. Most learned slowly, repeating the same mistakes year after year, hoping that this time would be different, that somehow the ground would stabilize, that their persistence would eventually be rewarded. And the land, indifferent to human timelines, simply continued its ancient cycle, freezing and thawing, expanding and contracting, following patterns older than any human presence, patterns that would continue long after the last cabin had collapsed and returned to the mud from which it came. The archaeological evidence of this process is still being uncovered, still being analyzed, still teaching modern researchers about the challenges of frontier settlement. Each excavated site adds to our understanding of how people adapted or failed to adapt, how knowledge spread or failed to spread, how some communities thrived while others collapsed. The patterns are clear in retrospect, visible now in ways they never were to the people living through them. We can map the successful homesteads and the failed ones, correlate them with soil types and drainage patterns and elevation, and see with perfect clarity what settlers learned only through bitter experience or sometimes never learned at all. But understanding these patterns now doesn't diminish the achievement of those who figured it out then, without soil surveys or hydrological studies, with nothing but observation and hard-won experience. They learned to read the land in its own language, to understand what different plants meant about water tables, what slight variations in elevation meant about spring flooding, what soil textures meant about drainage and stability. This knowledge became encoded in settlement patterns in the locations of towns and farms that succeeded, while others around them failed. If you look at maps of rural areas in the Northern Plains and Great Lakes region, you can still see this knowledge in the landscape in the way older settlements cluster on rises and well-drained ground, while the low spots and clay plains remain agricultural or undeveloped. The Thaw's lessons, learned slowly and painfully over decades of settlement, shaped the human geography of an entire region. Every town placed on high ground, every farm on sandy soil, every road that curves to avoid low spots represents knowledge extracted from the failures that came before, built on foundations that include not just physical materials, but accumulated wisdom about what works and what doesn't in this particular environment. And in the end, that's perhaps the only redemption in the story of frontier hardship, that the suffering wasn't entirely wasted, that future generations benefited from lessons learned by those who came before, that the pattern of failure and adaptation eventually produced knowledge that made settlement less brutal, more successful, more sustainable. The ground still freezes and thaws, still heaves and settles, still follows its ancient patterns, but now we build with that knowledge, plan with that understanding, and the spring thaw is no longer the season of collapse it once was for those who tried to settle this land without first learning to read its seasonal transformations. While Sarah Mercer watched the ground soften beneath her cabin and worried about when the earth would be dry enough to plow, there were others who also waited for the thaw to end, but whose waiting took a different form entirely. These were the men, and they were almost exclusively men, who held paper claims to the land, who had invested capital in frontier development, who stood to profit or lose based on how many settlers succeeded or failed, but who experienced the thaw season from a distance measured not just in miles but in comfort. In the land offices of territorial capitals, in the banking houses of eastern cities, in the headquarters of railroad companies planning westward expansion, the thaw meant something different than it did to those actually living through it. It meant delayed reports from surveyors, a temporary pause in land sales, waiting for information that would determine whether to invest more capital or to cut losses, and a general suspension of the regular flow of business correspondence that governed their operations. The waiting was real, the stakes were significant, but the experience bore almost no resemblance to the waiting happening in mud-bound cabins across the frontier. Consider the offices of the American Land Company in New York, spring of 1848. The company held title to several thousand acres in the Wisconsin and Minnesota territories, land they'd purchased from the government at $1.25 an acre, and hoped to sell to settlers for 5 or 10 times that amount. Their business model depended on a steady flow of new arrivals, on successful settlement that would make adjacent lands more valuable, on the general proposition that the frontier was not just survivable but prosperous. The thaw disrupted this flow every year, as predictably as the seasons themselves. Letters from agents in the field would stop arriving in March, resume sporadically in April, return to normal only in May or June, creating a communication blackout that frustrated every level of the company's operations. During this communication gap, the executives of the land company could only wait, could only make assumptions based on previous years, could only hope that this spring wouldn't be worse than the last. They waited in panelled offices heated by coal stoves, served lunch by staff, attended evening socials where they discussed business prospects with other men of capital. Their waiting was not physical discomfort but financial uncertainty, not hunger but potential profit foregone, not the fear of structural collapse but the anxiety of markets and investments beyond their immediate control. The weather that might determine a settler family's survival was to them primarily a factor affecting quarterly returns. There's a letter preserved in the company's archives written by a junior executive to his superior in April 1851 that captures this particular species of impatience. He writes about how frustrating it is to have no current information from the territories, how the company's plans for summer sales are being held up by this seasonal communication gap, how the board of directors is pressing for updates he can't provide. He complains about the inefficiency of it all, about how the thaw sets everything back by weeks, about how much smoother operations would be if they could maintain reliable contact year-round. The letter contains no acknowledgement of what the thaw meant for the settlers whose success or failure would determine the company's profits. No mention of mud or hunger or shifting foundations, no consideration of families watching their provisions dwindle while waiting for ground firm enough to plant. The thaw exists in this letter purely as an administrative inconvenience, a gap in information flow, a temporary impediment to business as usual. The executive's frustration is genuine, his impatience real, but it's a frustration that can be expressed from a position of security that carries no physical toll, that will end not when the ground dries, but when the mail service resumes. His discomfort manifests as pacing in a warm office, as terse exchanges with subordinates, as worry that expresses itself over dinner parties rather than in sleepless nights listening to cabin walls settle. The gulf between his experience and that of the settlers he never mentions is vast enough to constitute separate realities. This disconnect between lived experience and administrative concern appears throughout the historical record of frontier settlement. Government reports on territorial development acknowledge the thaw as a factor in delayed progress, but typically, in euphemistic language, seasonal impediments to transportation or temporary suspension of agricultural activities. The human cost of these impediments, the way they translated into hunger and hardship and structural failure, tends to be absent from official accounts. The reports are concerned with timelines and productivity metrics, with how the thaw affects settlement rates and land values, not with how it affects the settlers themselves. A territorial secretary might note that spring conditions delayed agricultural development by 3 weeks, recording this as simple data, a neutral fact about seasonal cycles. But those 3 weeks, for a family with calculated food stores, might mean the difference between adequate nutrition and hunger, between planting at the optimal time and planting too late to ensure a successful harvest. Railroad executives planning routes westward were perhaps more aware than most of the thaw's practical effects, since their surveyors and construction crews experienced it directly. The records of the Chicago and Northwestern Railway contain numerous reports from the 1850s and 60s describing how spring conditions delayed construction, how roadbed built on frozen ground would subside and buckle when the thaw came, how entire sections of track would need to be relaid once the ground stabilized. These were expensive lessons, measured in thousands of dollars per mile, and the company learned to plan for them, to build in delays and additional costs. But even here, the corporate response was primarily technical rather than human. They developed better surveying methods to identify stable ground, learning through costly mistakes which soil types would hold and which would betray them come spring. They learned to wait until May or June to begin construction in new territories, scheduling around the thaw rather than trying to work through it. They built in cost overruns to account for spring delays, adding 15 or 20% to budgets for routes through territories known to experience severe thaws. What they didn't do was meaningfully consider whether their planned routes served the settlers who would depend on those rail lines, whether a route that was easier to build might be less useful than one that connected to the places where people were actually trying to live. The logic was primarily economic: shortest distance, most cost-effective construction, best long-term returns for investors. The settlers, waiting for rail connections that would make shipping crops economically viable, that would allow them to bring in supplies without depending on wagon roads that vanished each spring, experienced these decisions as the difference between success and failure. But their input into planning was minimal to non-existent, their voices absent from the boardrooms where routes were decided and timetables set. They were not consulted but rather informed, not partners but customers, and the timetable for rail expansion was set by capital markets and construction logistics, not by the urgent needs of isolated homesteaders watching their stored food dwindle and their planting seasons slip away. There's a particular poignancy in reading the promotional materials that land companies and railroad corporations produced during this era. Bright lithographs showing fertile fields and sturdy cabins, text describing the opportunities awaiting industrious settlers, testimonials from successful farmers, all of it carefully curated to present frontier settlement as difficult perhaps, but reliably rewarding for those willing to work hard. The thaw appears in this promotional literature, if at all, as a minor seasonal transition, quickly passed, barely worth mentioning. One pamphlet from 1853, distributed by the Iowa Land and Development Company, describes the territory's climate as invigorating and healthful, with distinct seasons that provide natural rhythms for agricultural success. Spring is characterized as a time of renewal when the land awakens to productivity, with no mention of mud, flooding, structural instability, or the weeks of anxious waiting while watching supplies diminish. The illustration shows a neat cabin on dry ground, smoke rising cheerfully from its chimney, a farmer guiding a plow through dark, receptive soil. Contrast this with the actual letters and diaries of settlers, the desperate tone that enters in April and May, the calculations of dwindling resources, the fears about missed planting deadlines, and you see two entirely different frontiers, one that exists on paper and in the imaginations of investors, another that exists in mud and uncertainty and the grinding daily work of holding things together. The gap between these two frontiers was vast, and it was largely unbridgeable because those with the power to shape policy and allocate resources rarely experienced the conditions they were making decisions about. The territorial governors, appointed by Washington and tasked with encouraging settlement and development, occupied a peculiar middle ground. They lived in the territories, experienced some of the isolation and hardship, but their circumstances were vastly different from those of ordinary settlers. The governor's residence in Madison, Wisconsin Territory in the 1840s was a substantial frame house, well maintained, supplied through official channels that were more reliable than those available to homesteaders. The governor had staff, had a salary paid in cash, had connections to federal resources that could smooth over difficulties. When the spring thaw made travel impossible, the governor's household didn't face the same resource pressures as isolated homesteaders because their supplies were managed differently, ordered in larger quantities, delivered through military or official channels that continued to function even when civilian wagon routes became impassable. The governor might be frustrated by confinement, might chafe at the inability to conduct official business, but he wasn't counting sacks of cornmeal or rationing preserved meat. When governors wrote reports to Congress about conditions in their territories, they acknowledged challenges but typically emphasized progress, opportunity, resilience. This was partly political necessity. A governor who reported only difficulties would be seen as failing in his duty to promote settlement, might be replaced by someone more optimistic about the territory's prospects, but it also reflected their particular vantage point. From a well-maintained house in a capital town with reliable food supplies and dry floors, the frontier looked more manageable than it did from a listing cabin 3 days' journey into the backcountry. The governor saw settlers when they came to town for supplies or to conduct business at the land office, saw them at their most presentable in moments when they were functioning within civilization's structures. He didn't see them in their cabins during the Thaw's worst weeks, didn't witness the daily erosion of morale and resources, didn't observe how close to the edge many families were running. There's a report from the governor of Minnesota Territory in 1852 that illustrates this perfectly. He describes the winter as severe but the settlers as hardy, employing language that suggests challenge successfully met rather than ongoing crisis. He notes some spring flooding but characterizes it as temporarily inconvenient rather than significantly detrimental, a phrase that minimizes the actual impact on families trying to survive through those floods. He expresses confidence that agricultural production will meet expectations once the current season's crops are harvested. The report is optimistic, forward-looking, designed to encourage further investment and settlement, and it accomplishes this goal by presenting difficulties as manageable obstacles rather than potentially catastrophic challenges. Reading it, one would conclude that frontier life, while demanding, was well within the capabilities of industrious settlers. That same spring, mortality records from frontier settlements show a spike in deaths from pneumonia, dysentery, and what was often recorded simply as fever, likely a mix of typhoid and other waterborne diseases that flourished in the conditions created by the thaw. The records also show an increase in abandoned homesteads, properties that went back to territorial ownership because the claimants had either died or given up and moved on. None of this appears in the governor's report. It wasn't necessarily deliberate deception, but it reflected what he saw from where he stood, which was fundamentally different from what was visible from a sinking cabin on saturated ground. The governor's information came through official channels, through reports from land agents and military officers, through conversations with successful settlers who made it to town, the families who were failing, who were too isolated or too depleted to travel, who died without anyone in authority knowing their circumstances. These people existed outside his field of vision. The lawyers and speculators who dealt in land claims occupied yet another position in this hierarchy of experience. Many never visited the territories at all, buying and selling claims based purely on maps and descriptions, on projected values and anticipated development. For them, the frontier was entirely abstract. Section numbers, acreage figures, legal descriptions, investment vehicles divorced from any physical reality. A claim might represent a family's entire life savings and years of brutal work, or it might just be one line in a portfolio of properties held for speculation. The thaw affected these speculators only insofar as it delayed transactions, only as a timing issue in their calculations of when to buy and when to sell. They experienced it as a gap in paperwork, as a few weeks when transfers couldn't be processed and values couldn't be reliably assessed. There's something almost obscene in the casualness with which these transactions were conducted. A letter from one speculator to another discussing properties in Iowa. The spring difficulties seem to be somewhat prolonged this year, but I expect values to stabilize by midsummer and would recommend holding until then for best returns. The spring difficulties he mentioned so breezily were the weeks when families like the Mercers were watching their food supplies dwindle, were nursing sick children through damp nights, were wondering if they'd made a fatal mistake in coming to the frontier at all. But in the speculator's letter, these difficulties exist only as a factor in market timing, no more emotionally weighted than any other variable in a financial calculation. He might note that prolonged thaw conditions tend to result in more property turnovers, creating buying opportunities for those with capital to deploy. This pattern of some people's desperation creating others' opportunities appears repeatedly in the financial records of the period. The Methodist and Baptist missionary societies, which sent preachers to frontier settlements, operated with a different set of motivations than land speculators or railroad executives, but they too experienced the thaw from a position of relative privilege. The circuit riders who traveled between scattered settlements faced genuine hardship and danger. There are accounts of preachers struggling through mud, crossing swollen creeks, going hungry when they couldn't reach the next settlement. But they traveled light, depended on the hospitality of settlers for food and shelter, and could always retreat to more established towns when conditions became too difficult. They didn't have to make the land produce, didn't have structures that would settle or sink, didn't face the particular anxiety of watching planting seasons slip away. Their mission was spiritual rather than material, and while they took their calling seriously and often endured real privation in service to it, their relationship to the frontier was fundamentally different from that of the settlers they served. A circuit rider could experience thaw conditions as temporary discomfort. A settler experienced them as existential threat. The missionaries' letters and journals, many of which were published in denominational newspapers back east, provide valuable documentation of frontier conditions, but they also reveal a certain detachment, a quality of observation rather than full participation. A missionary might spend a night in a settler's cabin, note the dampness and discomfort, sympathize genuinely with the family's struggles, and then move on the next day. The settler stayed, lived with those conditions day after day, had no option to move on when things got too difficult. The missionary's account might become a compelling story in the church newsletter, might inspire donations to support frontier evangelism, might move readers to admiration for both the missionary's dedication and the settler's faith. But the settler's ongoing experience, the relentless dailiness of living in a failing structure on saturated ground, this rarely made it into the published accounts. One missionary journal from 1849 contains an entry that captures both the sympathy and the distance. The writer describes staying with a family whose cabin was in poor condition, sinking visibly into mud, the air inside damp and unwholesome. He writes about praying with the family, about their resignation and faith in the face of hardship, about being moved by their determination to persevere despite circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. And then he writes, "I departed the next morning with a heavy heart for their circumstances, but also with gratitude for the relative comforts afforded by my circuit, which, while not abundant, are sufficient and secure." The gratitude is genuine, but so is the gulf between his sufficient and secure circumstances and the family's visible suffering. He could leave, they could not. The army officers stationed at frontier posts occupied another distinct position. Forts existed partly to provide security, partly to project federal authority, and partly to support settlement through their purchasing power. They bought food and supplies from local settlers, providing a market that might not otherwise exist. The officers and enlisted men experienced some of the same isolation as settlers, endured long winters far from civilization, dealt with limited entertainment and the monotony of frontier garrison life. But they had structures built by military engineers, constructed to proper specifications on ground chosen for stability rather than availability. They had regular supply trains even when civilian roads were impassable, wagon trains that came through regardless of conditions because the army could command resources and enforce schedules. And they had the knowledge that their posting was temporary, that in 2 years or 3 they'd rotate back to more comfortable stations. Fort Snelling in Minnesota Territory had stone buildings with proper foundations, engineered drainage systems that channeled water away from structures, and a commissary stocked with months of provisions. Its commander, Colonel Henry Leavenworth, wrote reports describing conditions in the territory with the analytical detachment of someone whose own situation was secure. His reports acknowledge the challenges facing settlers, but also sometimes contain notes of impatience with their lack of preparedness, their tendency to settle in unsuitable locations, their apparent inability to adapt to conditions that, from the fort's perspective, seemed manageable if one simply planned properly. This impatience appears elsewhere too, in the writings of government agents, land office clerks, anyone whose position gave them some security while still bringing them into contact with frontier hardship. There's often an undertone of judgment, a sense that the settlers' difficulties reflected their own shortcomings rather than the genuine severity of conditions. If these people had built better, planned more carefully, worked harder, chosen land more wisely, the implication runs, they wouldn't be in such difficulty. The structural inequalities that made some people's experience of the thaw radically different from others rarely received acknowledgement. The fact that a military engineer had training and resources unavailable to most settlers, that an army commissary operated under entirely different logistics than a homesteader's food stores, that officers made decisions from positions of security that settlers never enjoyed, these contextual factors were invisible to those who had them. Success looked like virtue, failure looked like inadequacy, and the role of starting position disappeared from the analysis. Because the reality was that survival during the thaw season correlated strongly with starting resources. A settler who arrived with capital could afford to build on better ground, could pay surveyors to identify stable soil, could hire experienced builders who knew how to construct foundations that would withstand spring conditions. They could purchase better materials, seasoned lumber instead of green wood, proper roofing instead of makeshift coverings, iron stoves instead of inadequate fireplaces. They could afford to hire help during the critical spring planting period, meaning they could get crops in the ground as soon as conditions allowed, rather than having to do all the work themselves while also managing livestock and maintaining structures and dealing with sick children. They could afford to lose a year's harvest without facing starvation, could absorb the cost of failed crops or delayed planting, could weather setbacks that would destroy families operating without margin for error. A settler who arrived with nothing but determination and a land claim had no buffer, no margin for error, no way to overcome bad luck or bad judgment except through sheer endurance that might or might not be sufficient. The land offices didn't distinguish between these different classes of settlers in their accounting. A claim was a claim, a homestead was a homestead, and the records made no note of whether the claimant arrived with capital or arrived with nothing. But the actual experience of building those homesteads, of surviving the first years until the land became productive, varied enormously based on factors that had nothing to do with work ethic or moral character. Some people waited out the thaw in relative comfort because they had the resources to purchase comfort. They had cabins built on high ground with proper drainage. They had food stores that could last through delayed springs. They had cash reserves to buy supplies when their own ran short. Others endured it in damp cabins because they had no alternative, because every dollar had already been spent on the land claim and basic supplies, because there was no cushion between them and failure. And the system that governed frontier settlement tended to view these differences as natural and earned, rather than as accidents of circumstance that might warrant different kinds of support. There were exceptions, individual agents or officers or missionaries, who recognized the inequities and tried to help. The historical record contains accounts of army officers sharing supplies with desperate settlers, interpreting regulations generously to extend assistance that wasn't technically authorized. There are stories of government agents bending rules to help families in crisis, extending deadlines for proving up claims when spring conditions made it impossible to meet standard requirements, overlooking technicalities that would have resulted in families losing their land. And there are accounts of wealthier settlers extending credit or sharing resources with their struggling neighbors, recognizing that survival might require cooperation across economic lines. But these were individual acts of kindness within a system that was not designed to account for the differential impacts of seasonal hardship, moments of human decency that occurred despite institutional structures rather than because of them. The thaw revealed these inequities with particular clarity because it was a leveling force in some ways but not in others. The mud affected everyone. It didn't care about social class or capital, didn't distinguish between the well-funded and the desperate. Rich and poor alike faced impassable roads, delayed plantings, the frustration of enforced waiting. But the ability to wait out the mud, to absorb delays and losses, to maintain hope and stability while the ground remained unworkable, this varied dramatically. Those who waited in dry rooms could afford patience, could treat the thaw as an inconvenience rather than a crisis, could plan for next year because this year's failure wouldn't destroy them. Those who waited in listing cabins could not, because each day of delay meant resources consumed, opportunities missed, survival margins narrowed further. In the financial records of frontier settlement, this shows up as a pattern of property transfer. Claims that began with poor settlers often ended up in the hands of more prosperous ones, sold out of desperation or abandoned and then reclaimed. The transfer might happen in the fall after a failed harvest, the family finally accepting that they couldn't make it through another winter and selling for whatever they could get. Or it might happen in spring, the thaw revealing structural problems or resource shortages that made continuation impossible, the family selling before they'd even planted that year's crop. The thaw accelerated this process, functioning as a sorting mechanism that determined who had sufficient resources to weather it and who didn't. A family on the edge might survive through winter but give up during the difficult spring, selling their claim for a fraction of what they'd invested in it, selling to someone who had the resources to wait, to improve, to eventually profit from land that had broken someone else. This was sometimes described as natural selection, as the land rewarding the capable and punishing the inadequate. The language of social Darwinism, popular in the latter half of the 19th century, provided a framework for understanding these patterns as natural and just, as proof that frontier conditions sorted people according to their inherent worth. But capability and capital were not the same thing, even if the language of the time often conflated them. A capable farmer with insufficient resources might fail, where a mediocre farmer with ample capital might succeed, not because of any difference in skill or determination, but simply because one could absorb the costs that the thaw imposed and the other could not. The farmer who knew how to read soil, who understood crop timing, who could build sound structures, might still fail if he couldn't afford to build on good ground or couldn't survive the weeks of waiting for that ground to dry. Meanwhile, a farmer with less knowledge but more capital could hire expertise, could afford mistakes, could learn through failure without being destroyed by it. The historical memory of frontier settlement tends to emphasize individual resilience, to celebrate those who succeeded through hard work and determination. This narrative is not entirely wrong. Those qualities mattered, certainly, and many successful settlers possessed them in abundance, but it's incomplete, a partial truth that becomes misleading through what it omits. It omits the role of starting position, of differential access to resources, of the way that some people's waiting was fundamentally different from others, because it occurred in contexts that provided shelter from the worst consequences of delay. It creates a story in which success proves virtue and failure proves inadequacy, erasing the structural factors that sorted people as much as their individual qualities did. Reading through the archives of this period, moving between the letters of struggling settlers and the reports of comfortable officials, between personal diaries recording daily desperation and business correspondence discussing frontier development as an investment opportunity, the overwhelming impression is of parallel worlds occupying the same geographical space but experiencing it in fundamentally different ways. The thaw that nearly broke Sarah Mercer's family was, for a land speculator in Boston, merely a line in a quarterly report, a note about delayed transactions and temporarily uncertain values. The mud that swallowed Thomas Mercer's hope of timely planting was, for a railroad executive, just a temporary impediment to surveying routes, a scheduling problem to be solved through better planning and adjusted timelines. The fever that killed settler children in damp cabins was, for a territorial governor, a statistic in a mortality report, noted but not dwelt upon, mentioned but not allowed to overshadow the general narrative of progress and opportunity. These weren't evil people, these comfortable observers and distant decision-makers. They were operating within systems that encouraged them to view the frontier abstractly, to focus on aggregate outcomes rather than individual experiences, to see settlers as data points in larger calculations about development and profit. Many of them believed genuinely in the frontier's promise, saw themselves as facilitating opportunity for ordinary people, took pride in their role in national expansion, and the settlers themselves often bought into this logic, saw their own hardships as temporary prices to pay for eventual prosperity, believed that the system, for all its difficulties, offered them opportunities they couldn't have found elsewhere. The promise of land ownership, of independence from landlords and employers, of building something that would belong to them and their children, this promise was powerful enough to sustain people through extraordinary hardship. It wasn't a false promise exactly, but it was one that played out very differently for different people depending on resources they brought with them. But the Thaw, year after year, revealed the costs of this arrangement with particular clarity. It showed who had the resources to wait and who didn't, who could absorb delays and who operated without margin for delay, who experienced seasonal transitions as inconveniences and who experienced them as existential threats. It demonstrated that patience was a luxury not everyone could afford, that waiting itself was a privilege distributed unequally. It sorted people not just by their abilities, but by their starting positions, by the buffers they had or didn't have, by whether their waiting happened in rooms with dry floors and reliable food, or in cabins where the ground itself was betraying them. And it did this sorting with mechanical efficiency year after year, creating patterns that would shape the region for generations. And perhaps what's most striking is how little this inequality was acknowledged, how thoroughly the discourse of the time attributed outcomes to individual virtue rather than structural advantage. The families who succeeded were praised for their perseverance, held up as examples of what frontier spirit could accomplish, celebrated in local histories and territorial narratives. Their success validated the entire enterprise, proved that the frontier could be conquered by those with sufficient determination. The families who failed were often blamed for poor judgment, inadequate preparation, insufficient determination. If they'd chosen better land, built more carefully, planned more thoroughly, the implication ran, they would have succeeded like their neighbors. The role of differential resources, of some people having to endure what others merely had to wait through, rarely made it into the official narratives, the celebratory histories, the accounts that shaped how the frontier would be remembered. The land remembered, though. Archaeological sites show the pattern clearly. Abandoned homesteads clustered on marginal ground, on poorly drained soil, in locations that those with more resources would have avoided or improved. These sites contain the debris of lives that couldn't be sustained, broken tools, collapsed structures, graves of children who died in the struggle. The successful homesteads, the ones that lasted and eventually became prosperous farms, tend to be on better ground, started by people who had the capital to choose wisely and to absorb early setbacks. The land kept its own record of who had the privilege of patience and who had to gamble everything on ground that might not hold them. You can read this record still in the distribution of old farmsteads, in the patterns of which properties succeeded and which failed, in the physical evidence of who could wait out the thaw in security and who had to endure it with everything at stake. The inequality that shaped frontier settlement is written into the landscape for those who know how to read it, preserved in a way that the official histories never quite captured. And so we arrive at the end of our quiet journey through the muddy months, through the season that history so often forgets. We've walked, or waded, alongside those who discovered that survival meant learning, to read a landscape that didn't match their expectations, that relief could wear the mask of new difficulty, that spring could test them in ways winter never had. Think back now to where we began, to that first morning of waking to the sound of water, of stepping into boots that would never quite dry, of watching the solid ground of winter transform into something uncertain and alive. Remember Sarah Mercer, reading her letters by whatever light could penetrate the grey spring sky, recording her family's struggles with a careful hand that tried to maintain hope even as the ground beneath her shifted. Remember the archaeological sites scattered across the Northern Territories, the tilted posts and collapsed foundations that mark where people tried and sometimes failed to build permanence on impermanent ground. We've seen how the Thaw was not just a physical challenge but a kind of education, teaching lessons about humility and adaptation that no guidebook had prepared settlers for. We've traced the science of freezing and thawing, the way water expands and earth loses its cohesion, the patterns that indigenous peoples had understood for generations, but that arriving settlers had to learn through bitter experience. We've witnessed the gulf between those who waited in comfort and those who endured in damp cabins, the way the same season could mean such different things depending on where you stood and what resources you'd brought to the encounter. The Thaw is largely forgotten now in our collective memory of the frontier. When we think of Western expansion, of homesteading, of those who settled the territories beyond the Mississippi, we tend to remember dramatic moments, harsh winters, conflicts, the loneliness of vast distances. Spring appears in this memory as relief, as awakening, as the season when things got easier. But for those who lived it, spring was often when things got harder, when the certainties of winter gave way to the uncertainties of mud and water and ground that couldn't be trusted. There's something almost poetic in this forgetting, in how we've chosen to remember the seasons that tested people in obvious ways, while forgetting the season that tested them more subtly, but perhaps more thoroughly. Winter was an adversary you could face directly, could prepare for, could understand in terms of endurance and survival. The Thaw was trickier, more ambiguous, harder to narrate as a simple story of human will against natural force. It was slow rather than dramatic, uncertain rather than clearly dangerous, and its lessons were about adaptation rather than conquest. Perhaps this is why it slipped from memory, because it didn't fit the narratives we preferred to tell about frontier settlement, about progress and mastery and the triumph of civilization over wilderness. The Thaw suggested something else, something less comfortable, that the land had its own rhythms, its own logic, and that human success depended not on overcoming these patterns, but on learning to work within them. This was a less heroic story, a quieter kind of wisdom, and so it faded from the official accounts even as it remained vivid in the private letters and journals of those who'd lived through it. But the Thaw shaped the frontier as surely as any winter storm. It determined which settlements succeeded and which failed. It taught crucial lessons about reading landscape, about choosing ground, about the limits of determination when facing physical processes that no amount of hard work could overcome. It sorted people not just by their strength but by their adaptability, their willingness to learn from failure, their capacity to adjust expectations to match reality rather than insisting reality conform to expectations. And it revealed something about inequality that was often obscured in other contexts. The mythology of frontier settlement emphasized equal opportunity. Everyone got their 160 acres, everyone faced the same land, the same challenges. But the Thaw showed how unequal that equality was. The same mud affected everyone, but not everyone had the same resources for waiting it out, for absorbing delays and losses, for maintaining stability while the ground remained unworkable. Some waited in dry rooms while others waited in listing cabins, and this difference mattered more than any amount of individual determination could overcome. Lying here now in your own time, in your own place, you might feel the distance between yourself and those frontier settlers as vast, unbridgeable. Your floor is solid, your walls are straight, your food supply is reliable, and your water is clean. The seasons affect you, certainly, but not in ways that threaten your survival, not with the grinding daily uncertainty that characterized frontier life during the thaw. You are separated from that experience by more than just time, by infrastructure and technology and accumulated knowledge, by all the systems that buffer us from direct dependence on the land's seasonal rhythms. And yet perhaps there's something in their experience that still resonates, still speaks to us across those years and that distance. The settlers facing the thaw were learning that some difficulties can't be overcome by determination alone, that wisdom sometimes means accepting what you can't control, that survival can require changing your expectations rather than changing your circumstances. These are lessons that transcend any particular historical moment, that speak to something fundamental about being human, about facing challenges that don't have simple solutions, about learning to work with conditions rather than against them. The thaw also reminds us that difficulty is often most profound not in moments of crisis but in periods of uncertainty, in the slow wearing down of resources and hope, in the accumulation of small problems that together become overwhelming. Winter had clear rules: stay warm, stay fed, endure. The thaw had no such clarity. Each day brought new evidence of things shifting, settling, moving in ways you couldn't predict or prevent. This kind of difficulty is harder to narrate, harder to dramatize, but anyone who's faced extended periods of uncertainty, of waiting for conditions to improve while resources dwindle and options narrow, might recognize something of themselves in those muddy months. There's a comfort in knowing that others before us have faced uncertainty and found their way through it, not with triumph or heroic gestures, but with quiet persistence, with adaptation, with the willingness to learn from conditions rather than fighting them endlessly. Sarah Mercer and her family survived not because they conquered the thaw, but because they learned to work within its constraints, to adjust their plans, to accept that some things couldn't be forced or rushed. This is a gentler kind of success than the frontier mythology usually celebrates, but perhaps it's a more sustainable one, more applicable to the kinds of challenges most of us actually face. As we come to the end of this long night's journey into the past, let your breathing slow even further. Let the accumulated weight of the day continue to lift from your shoulders. The struggles we've traced tonight are over now, long over. The mud has dried, the ground has stabilized, and where uncertain homesteads once stood, there are now solid structures, paved roads, systems that manage water and prevent the worst of seasonal disruption. The lessons were learned, slowly and at great cost, but learned nonetheless. You can rest easy tonight knowing that the thaw tested a generation, and that generation passed its examinations not through any dramatic victory, but through patient adaptation, through learning to read the land, through building their understanding failure by failure until they finally got it right. Their patient struggle created the accumulated knowledge that makes our own lives easier, that lets us live year-round in places where the ground still freezes and thaws, but where we've learned to build in ways that account for this, that work with the land's rhythms rather than against them. Let yourself drift now towards sleep, carrying with you perhaps an image of spring, not as the simple renewal we usually imagine, but as something more complex, more real. A season of transformation that is neither purely difficult nor purely hopeful, but somehow both at once. Picture the settlers watching their fields, waiting for the moment when the earth would finally be ready to receive seed, learning patience not as a virtue, but as a necessity, as the only response to conditions that couldn't be rushed. Feel the solid ground beneath you now, the dry warmth of your bed, the security of walls that don't shift or settle, the comfort of knowing that tomorrow's challenges, whatever they might be, won't include wondering if your shelter will hold, or if your food will last, or if the ground itself will support you. These comforts were built on the hard lessons of those muddy months, on the accumulated experience of generations who learned slowly what worked and what didn't, who adapted their methods and their expectations until they finally harmonized with the land's own logic. Rest now in the knowledge that difficulty passes, that seasons turn, that ground which seems permanently unstable will eventually firm up and become reliable again. Rest knowing that patient endurance, while perhaps not as dramatic as heroic triumph, is often what actually carries us through extended challenges. Rest knowing that learning to work with conditions rather than against them is not surrender, but wisdom. The Thaw taught this wisdom to those who could learn it, and in learning it, they built the foundations, literal and metaphorical, on which we still stand. Their struggle is over, their lessons preserved, their patient work completed. And we, inheritors of their slowly accumulated knowledge, can rest easier because they endured those uncertain weeks year after year until they finally understood what the land had been trying to teach them all along. Let your eyes close now if they haven't already. Let the images from tonight's journey fade gently into the deeper darkness of sleep. The cabin doors are secure, the roofs are sound, the ground is solid beneath us. The thaw has passed. Spring has settled into summer, and the crops are growing in fields that finally cooperated, that finally revealed the patterns that made them workable. All is quiet now in those old territories, quiet with the peace that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the completion of long struggle, from lessons learned and wisdom earned. The frontier that tested so many has receded into history, has become the foundation for everything that came after, and we can rest on that foundation tonight, grateful for the solid ground, grateful for the dry rooms, grateful for all the accumulated adaptations that let us live with ease in places where others once struggled so mightily. Sleep now, gently, peacefully, letting the weight of history settle like a soft blanket over your own time, your own place, your own moment of rest. The thaw was harder than the freeze, yes, but both have passed, and what remains is only the quiet that comes after struggle, the stillness that follows strain, the deep rest that we've earned simply by making it through another day in our own lives, in our own time. The ground is solid, the walls are straight, the seasons turn, but we are sheltered from their harshest lessons. Rest now, deeply and well, as night deepens toward its quietest hours, as the past releases its hold, and sleep draws you gently down into its own thaw, its own melting away of tension and worry and the accumulated weight of consciousness. Rest, sleep, let go. The frontier is quiet now, the settlers are at peace, and you too can release the day and drift into the soft darkness where all history dissolves, where all struggle ceases, where there is only the gentle rhythm of breathing, the slow fade of awareness, the welcome descent into sleep's deep shelter. Good night, traveller through time. May your own ground remain solid, your own spring bring easier renewals, and your own rest tonight be deep and untroubled, free from mud and worry, held safe in the accumulated comfort of all the lessons learned by all the people who came before, who struggled and adapted and survived, who taught us through their persistence that patience, in the end, is not just a virtue, but a necessity, and that sometimes the hardest thing is simply to wait, to adapt, and to trust that the ground will firm up again, that spring will eventually settle, that difficult seasons do pass, and that rest, when it finally comes, is all the sweeter for having been earned through endurance. Sleep well, sleep deeply. Let the thaw fade into memory, let the mud dry into solid earth, let all uncertainty dissolve into the peaceful darkness of a night well earned, a rest well deserved, a sleep that heals and restores and prepares you gently for whatever tomorrow might bring. Good night.